Victoria started laughing before the lawyer finished the sentence. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't disbelief. It was bright and careless. The kind of laugh you give when something confirms what you already believe to be true. And to my eldest daughter, Victoria, hail! Daniel Whitmore's voice carried evenly across the long mahogany table in his Naperville office. I leave the primary residence and the remaining liquid assets, totaling approximately $1.3 million. A pause. And to my younger daughter. Paper shifted. I watched his eyes move down the page. I leave my personal effects to be divided at the discretion of my eldest daughter. That was it. No trust. No allocation. No figure attached to my name. Victoria leaned back in her chair and let out a soft, satisfied breath that turned into a laugh she didn't bother to hide. A few relatives exchanged glances. Someone murmured, "Oh, honey," under their breath. Victoria tilted her head toward me. "You've always been so independent. Live," she said. Just loud enough. Mom knew you didn't need anything. Every face in the room shifted toward mine, waiting for a crack. A protest. Tears. Something. I folded my hands in my lap. I didn't speak, and neither did Daniel Whitmore. He simply closed the thin stack of papers in front of him. Then he reached for a second file. "We're not quite finished," he said. The laughter stopped. "My name is Olivia Harris. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a senior data analyst for a regional financial firm outside Chicago. I've built my career on patterns, on finding the anomaly in a sea of numbers and asking why it doesn't fit. In my family, I was never the anomaly. I was the constant. Victoria is 3 years older than I am. Growing up, she was the emotional center of every room. If she was anxious, the house was tense. If she was hurt, plans were canceled. If she was disappointed, celebrations were postponed. I learned early that being steady was my role. When Victoria failed her driver's test, my 16th birthday dinner was rescheduled. When she went through a breakup in college, my scholarship letter sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Mom wasn't cruel. She was protective. And Victoria always needed more protecting. By the time we sat in Daniel Whitmore's office, everyone in that room already believed they understood the ending. I was the capable one. The practical one. The daughter who moved to Naperville, built a stable career, bought her own condo without cosigners. Victoria stayed closer to home in Aurora. She started and paused several ventures: event planning, boutique retail, short-term property rentals. Mom helped her bridge the gaps. Temporary support. She called it. No one ever asked whether temporary had an expiration date. Daniel slid the second file forward. It was thicker, cream-colored, sealed with a paper tab. Victoria frowned slightly. "What's that?" she asked. "A codicil," Daniel replied calmly. "An amendment to the will, executed 6 months prior to Margaret Hale's passing." The room shifted again. Chairs creaked. My aunt leaned forward. Daniel broke the seal. I felt my pulse in my throat. But my expression didn't change. Years of boardroom presentations had trained me well. He began reading. "Upon review of my estate and after consultation with counsel, I direct that the total liquid assets and proceeds from the sale of my primary residence be placed into the Hale Family Trust." Victoria's posture stiffened. "Trust?" she repeated under her breath. Daniel continued. "The trust shall be administered by my appointed trustee, Olivia Harris." The air left the room in a single, collective breath. Victoria's face drained of color. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "That wasn't in the original draft. This amendment supersedes prior distributions," Daniel said evenly. "Olivia Harris is the sole trustee with fiduciary authority over disbursement." I kept my eyes on the table. The words felt heavy, but not surprising. Daniel turned the page. "Distributions to my eldest daughter, Victoria Hale, shall be structured and conditional. Initial disbursement shall not exceed annual limits as outlined in Appendix B. Further distributions are contingent upon documented repayment of outstanding personal loans made by the grantor. The word loans hung in the air like something fragile and sharp. Victoria's laugh was gone now. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Mom never called them loans." Daniel didn't look up. The amendment references documented transfers totaling $480,000 over a 7-year period. My uncle shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's eyes flicked toward me. "Did you know about this?" I met her gaze for the first time that morning. "Yes," I said. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't triumphant. It was simple. 6 months before Mom passed, she asked me to review her investment accounts. She said she felt foggy about certain balances. I sat at her kitchen table with my laptop, and her statements spread out in neat rows. I remember the first time I noticed the pattern. Large transfers marked as short-term reallocations. No repayment schedule. No formal documentation. "Is this a joint investment?" I had asked. Mom had gone quiet. I trusted her, she said softly. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just listened as I walked her through the numbers. 6 weeks later, she called Daniel Whitmore. Back in the office, Daniel finished reading the amendment. "This trust structure is designed to protect estate assets and ensure responsible management," he concluded. "Olivia Harris has full discretionary authority within fiduciary guidelines." Victoria pushed her chair back sharply. "This is manipulation," she said. "You pressured her." "I didn't," I replied. My voice was steady, the same voice I used in quarterly earnings meetings. I showed her the statements. Silence settled over the room. Not awkward silence. Not sympathetic silence. A different kind. The kind that arrives when a narrative fractures. Victoria had walked into that office expecting to be confirmed as the chosen daughter. The protected one. The unquestioned one. Instead, the record spoke. Daniel closed the file gently. "The trust is effective immediately," he said. "Assets will be transferred within 30 days. Victoria stared at the table. No one looked at me with pity now. They looked at me with something else. Calculation. For most of my life, I had been the quiet daughter. That morning, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply sat there while the paperwork did what I never had. It corrected the record. And for the first time, Victoria wasn't laughing. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Daniel Whitmore's office, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people move in and out of neighboring storefronts as if nothing in the world had shifted. Across the lot, Victoria stood beside her SUV, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Even from a distance, I could read her posture, controlled, urgent, already constructing a version of events that made sense to her. I had seen that posture my entire life. When we were children and she broke a neighbor's window with a softball, she had explained it so convincingly that by the end of the afternoon, Mrs. Callahan was apologizing for placing the flower pot too close to the fence. When Victoria's first boutique failed, it wasn't poor inventory management. It was a changing retail climate. When her event planning business stalled, it wasn't unpaid invoices. It was unreliable vendors. There was always a reason. There was always a story. And there was always someone else quietly smoothing the edges behind her. For years, that someone had been Mom. Sometimes, it had been me. I finally started the engine and drove toward my condo in Naperville. The sky was a pale Illinois gray, the kind that flattens everything into a single tone. I liked days like that. Neutral. Predictable. When I pulled into my building's underground garage, my phone buzzed. "Victoria." I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Then a text. "You had no right." Followed by, "She wasn't in her right mind." I stared at the screen for a long moment before sliding it into my bag. 6 months before Mom passed, she had called me one evening and asked if I could look at something. She sounded embarrassed. Not confused. Not fragile. Embarrassed. I drove to her house in Aurora with my laptop and a notebook. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the pot roast she had reheated for dinner. She had already laid out her financial statements in neat stacks. "I think I've been careless," she said quietly. We sat at the same oak table where Victoria and I had done homework as kids. I opened the first statement. The pattern emerged within minutes. Large transfers labeled temporary support. No corresponding repayments. No interest documentation. No written agreements. Were these investments? I asked. Mom pressed her lips together. They were bridges, she said. She always needed a bridge. I didn't respond immediately. I scrolled through 7 years of statements. The total climbed steadily. $480,000. That's nearly half the liquid estate, I said finally. Mom didn't argue. She didn't defend Victoria. She just nodded once, as if confirming something she had already known but needed to hear aloud. I don't want to leave you cleaning this up, she said. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was fatigue. Back in my condo, I set my bag on the kitchen counter and walked to the window. From the 6th floor, I could see the train line that ran through Naperville. A Metro train passed slowly, steady and on schedule. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my aunt. "Oh, Olivia," she began carefully. "That was unexpected." "Yes," I said. "She must have had her reasons." "She did," I replied. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the weight of unasked questions. "Victoria feels blindsided," my aunt continued. "I'm sure she does." Another pause. "You knew about the amendment?" "Yes." I didn't elaborate. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence in the lawyer's office. At the will reading, the silence had been heavy with shock. Here, it felt like space. Growing up, space had never belonged to me. When Victoria panicked before her SAT exam, Mom slept in her room for a week. When Victoria's landlord threatened eviction after missed rent, Mom refinanced the house to cover it. When I graduated from Northwestern with honors, Mom hugged me warmly and said, "You'll be fine." It wasn't dismissal. It was certainty. I built my life around that certainty. I became fine. Stable job. Clean credit. Predictable savings plan. While Victoria's ventures rose and fell, I tracked data for regional pension funds and institutional portfolios. I understood risk exposure. I understood liquidity. I understood what happens when capital flows without controls. Mom had called it bridges. In finance, we call it unsecured leverage. There was a knock at my door. Sharp. Quick. Familiar. I checked the time. 7. 18 pages. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. "Liv. Open the door." Victoria's voice carried through the hallway. I stayed where I was. "This is insane," she continued. "You think you're some kind of financial guardian now?" I walked to the door but didn't unlock it. "I'm not discussing this in the hallway," I said. "You manipulated her," she snapped. "She was sick. She asked me to review her accounts. You made it sound worse than it was." I rested my hand lightly against the door. I showed her the numbers. There was silence on the other side. "She trusted me," Victoria said. Softer now. "She trusted both of us," I replied. "That's why she changed it." Her breathing grew sharper. "You could decline," she said quickly. "You could refuse to be trustee. Let it go back to normal." Normal? The word lingered. Normal meant temporary transfers with no documentation. It meant refinanced mortgages. It meant quiet adjustments behind closed doors. "I won't decline," I said. "You're tearing this family apart over paperwork." "It isn't paperwork," I replied. "It's structure." Her hand struck the door once in frustration. "You always think you're right because you have spreadsheets." "No," I said calmly. "I think I'm right because Mom signed it." Silence again. A different kind this time. "You're enjoying this," she said finally. "I'm not." And that was true. There was no victory in my chest. No thrill. Only responsibility. "I need you to leave," I added. After a moment, I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. I waited until the elevator doors opened and closed before I exhaled fully. I walked back to the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The trust activation email from Daniel Whitmore sat unread in my inbox. I clicked it open. Effective immediately. The Hale Family Trust would begin asset transfer procedures. As trustee, I would be responsible for oversight, documentation, and compliance. For most of my life, I had been the steady one in the background. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I realized something simple and irreversible. I wasn't being chosen because I was louder. I was being chosen because I kept records. And this time, I wasn't going to close the file. Daniel called me at 9:12 the next morning. "She's contesting," he said without preamble. I was already at my desk. Dual monitors glowing with quarterly portfolio data I hadn't fully processed. "On what grounds?" I asked. "Undue influence. Questioning your mother's mental capacity at the time of the amendment." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "That's not accurate," I said. "I'm aware," he replied evenly. Accuracy and allegations are not always aligned. Outside my glass office wall, analysts moved between cubicles with coffee cups and tablets, discussing risk exposure and projected returns. The world remained structured, predictable. Inside the call, the ground shifted. "She's claiming you pressured her," Daniel continued. "That you framed routine financial assistance as mismanagement. Routine financial assistance. $480,000. Has she filed formally?" I asked. "Yes. Petition submitted to probate court this morning." I stared at the skyline beyond the window. Naperville's downtown buildings rose in neat, contained lines. "She'll request access to all correspondence between you and your mother," he added. "Emails, texts, calendar entries?" "That's fine," I said. "Be sure. I am." After we hung up, I opened a secure folder on my laptop and began exporting archived email threads. Timestamps, attachments, subject lines. I remembered the night Mom asked me to review the accounts. I had sent her a follow-up email summarizing what we'd discussed. Attached. Annotated transaction spreadsheet. Her reply had been brief. "Thank you for walking me through this." I didn't realize how much had accumulated. That was it. No anger. No confusion. Clarity. At noon, HR called me into a conference room. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation," Karen from Human Resources said gently. "We received an anonymous inquiry this morning regarding your professional ethics." I didn't flinch. "Anonymous," I repeated. "A caller expressed concern that you may have exerted financial pressure on a vulnerable family member." The phrasing was careful. I slid a folder across the table. "This contains the probate amendment, signed and notarized, along with legal counsel confirmation." I said, "My role is fiduciary. Court supervised." Karen scanned the first page. "We're not opening an investigation," she assured me. "But we needed documentation." "You have it." She nodded. I left the room steady, but not untouched. Victoria had escalated quickly. That evening, my phone lit up with messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "Heard things are getting messy. Family should stay private. Are you sure this is worth it?" The subtext was clear. "Why didn't you just let her have it?" I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed the transaction log again. 7 years of temporary support. 3 separate transfers above $100,000. No repayment entries. I pulled property records for Aurora and surrounding areas. It wasn't difficult. County filings are public. 2 properties listed under Hale Event Solutions, LLC. 1 under a newly formed entity, Northbridge Holdings. The registered address matched Victoria's townhouse. Northbridge. I stared at the name. Bridge. Mom's word. I opened the formation documents. Manager. Victoria Hale. Secondary authorized signatory. Daniel Reeves. Her boyfriend. I scrolled further. Date of LLC formation. 3 weeks before one of the largest transfers from Mom's account. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with precision. I printed the filings and placed them in a manila folder. The next day, Daniel called again. "Prepare for discovery requests," he said. "Her attorney will argue your involvement created undue pressure." She asked me to look at the accounts. I replied, "Then that's what we'll demonstrate." "Does she know about Northbridge Holdings?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Why?" he said carefully. I explained what I'd found. Silence stretched. "That wasn't disclosed in her initial petition," he said slowly. "Forward me the documentation." After the call, I sat still for a long moment. This wasn't just emotional. It wasn't sibling rivalry. It was structure versus assumption. Victoria had always operated in the space between intention and documentation. Mom had filled the gap. Now the gap was visible. Friday evening, Victoria posted on social media. Some people mistake control for care. The caption sat beneath a filtered sunset photo. Comments poured in. "Stay strong. Family drama is the worst. You deserve peace." I didn't engage. Instead, I drove to Aurora. Mom's house was already under listing preparation. The lawn trimmed. Realtor sign pending. I stood in the driveway as dusk settled. Inside those walls, Victoria had cried on the kitchen floor over failed ventures. Inside those walls, Mom had refinanced twice. Inside those walls, I had shown her the spreadsheet. I walked around to the backyard and sat on the old wooden bench. Mom's voice echoed in memory. I trusted her. Not I believed her. Not I assumed. Trusted. Trust implies expectation. Expectation implies accountability. My phone buzzed. Unknown number? I let it ring. Then a voicemail notification. "This is Thomas Keller with Keller and Associates. Representing Victoria Hale. Please return my call regarding the pending probate contest." It had begun formally. Back in my car, I exhaled slowly. Victoria wasn't just contesting the trust. She was contesting the idea that documentation mattered. The following Monday, a certified letter arrived at my condo. Notice of petition to invalidate codicil. I read it twice. Claims included emotional manipulation, financial coercion, exploitation of a medically vulnerable adult. Each phrase sharp and deliberate. I closed the envelope and placed it inside the growing manila folder. For most of my life, I had avoided confrontation by stepping aside. This time, stepping aside would mean dissolving structure back into assumption. And assumption had cost nearly half the estate. I sat at my dining table, pen in hand, writing a summary timeline for Daniel. Dates. Transfers. LLC formation. No commentary. Just facts. By midnight, the folder was thicker. The contest wasn't about grief. It was about control. Victoria had lost it in the lawyer's office. Now she was trying to reclaim it in court. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights. In the dark, the shape of the situation felt clear. She believed emotion would outweigh documentation. She believed family loyalty would override paper. She had forgotten one thing. I don't argue narratives. I audit them. And this one had already left a trail. The first probate hearing was set for a Thursday morning in DuPage County. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls. Fluorescent lights. A seal of the state of Illinois mounted above the judge's bench. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Victoria sat at the petitioner's table with her attorney. Thomas Keller? She wore navy. Her hair pulled back neatly. A posture that suggested composure. Daniel Reeves sat behind her in the gallery. When she saw me take my seat beside Daniel Whitmore, her jaw tightened slightly. Not rage. Calculation. The judge entered, and the room rose. "This matter concerns the estate of Margaret Hale," the clerk announced. Victoria's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, we are petitioning to invalidate the codicil executed 6 months prior to the decedent's passing. We believe the amendment was the product of undue influence exerted by the trustee, Olivia Harris." He spoke clearly, confidently. "Specifically," he continued, "we question the decedent's mental clarity and independence at the time of execution." Mental clarity. I kept my hands folded. Daniel Whitmore rose slowly. The amendment was drafted in my office, under private consultation with Margaret Hale, he said. It was signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized. No one else was present during her instruction or execution. The judge nodded. Was the decedent evaluated for cognitive impairment at that time? The judge asked. No, Daniel replied. There was no medical basis for such evaluation. Victoria's attorney shifted. We intend to request full discovery of communications between Mrs. Harris and the decedent, he said. We believe the financial review presented by Ms. Harris was framed in a way that caused unnecessary alarm. Unnecessary alarm. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The judge looked toward Daniel. Discovery will proceed. Schedule a continuation hearing. Gavel. That was it. Outside the courtroom, Victoria approached me before Daniel could intercept. You're really doing this, she said quietly. I'm responding, I replied. She was sick. She was precise. Victoria's eyes flashed. You made it sound like I stole from her. I showed her statements. That's interpretation. No, I said. That's math. She laughed once, short. Humorless. You've always thought numbers made you right. They make things measurable. She stepped closer. You think this makes you powerful? I held her gaze. I think it makes things clear. Daniel placed a hand lightly on my elbow. Let's go, he murmured. In the parking lot, he spoke without preamble. They'll attempt to paint you as aggressive, he said. Emotionally detached. Possibly resentful. I'm not resentful. That won't stop the narrative. I understood that for years. Victoria's strength had been narrative. Now she was building one again. Back at my condo, I opened the email archive Daniel had requested. I exported every exchange between Mom and me over the past 2 years. Subject lines: investment review, portfolio summary, quarterly adjustments. There was no urgency in the tone of those messages. No alarm. Just clarity. I forwarded them to Daniel. That evening, I received a formal request from Keller and Associates. All communications between myself and the decedent. All financial analysis prepared. Any notes or summaries created during estate review. I printed the request and added it to the folder. The next week, Victoria posted another message online. Truth always surfaces. The implication hung between the words, relatives began calling more frequently. She feels betrayed. My aunt said, she filed a petition. I replied, she's grieving too. So am I. The line went quiet. Grief, in our family, had always been louder when it came from Victoria. Mine was expected to be quiet. Saturday afternoon, I drove to Mom's house to meet the realtor. The for sale sign had been planted in the lawn. Inside, the rooms were half cleared, furniture staged minimally. I walked into the kitchen and ran my fingers along the edge of the oak table. The memory returned without invitation. Mom sitting across from me. Statements spread neatly between us. I don't want to leave chaos, she had said. You're not, I told her. I might have already. I closed my eyes briefly in the empty kitchen. Victoria had framed this as coercion, as manipulation. But Mom had initiated that review. She had asked for clarity. On Monday, Daniel called again. They've formally alleged emotional coercion, he said. Claiming you emphasized worst-case scenarios. I outlined exposure, I replied, which can be characterized as alarmist. It was accurate. Yes, he said calmly. Accuracy and perception are different battles. He paused. There's something else. They're requesting forensic review of the financial transfers. My fingers tightened around the phone. Good, I said. Be careful what you wish for. I'm not afraid of the records. I'm not concerned about your records, he said. I'm concerned about what may surface beyond what we've already identified. I thought of Northbridge Holdings, of formation dates and property deeds. Send them everything, I said. The following week, the second hearing was scheduled. In the interim, both sides would submit documentation for preliminary review. That night, I sat at my dining table surrounded by printed bank statements, LLC filings, and annotated spreadsheets. I wasn't looking for ammunition. I was looking for continuity. Patterns don't lie. They repeat. I traced one of the larger transfers again. Date: March 12th. Amount: $125. 000. 3 weeks later, Northbridge Holdings property acquisition. Purchase price below market. Financing structure unclear. I leaned back slowly. Victoria wasn't just contesting the trust. She was defending a structure built quietly beneath it. My phone buzzed. Victoria. This time, I answered. What? I said. You think you're exposing something? She demanded. I'm reviewing records. You're humiliating me. I didn't file the petition. She inhaled sharply. You always wanted to be the responsible one. I am the responsible one. Her voice dropped. You're going to regret digging. I held the phone away for a second, letting the silence settle. I don't dig, I said finally. I audit. I ended the call. For years. Victoria had relied on momentum, on moving quickly enough that no one paused to examine details. Now everything was paused, examined, measured. The courtroom would decide the legal question. But the documents were already speaking. And they weren't laughing. The forensic accountant's name was Alan Pierce. He arrived at Daniel Whitmore's office on a Tuesday morning carrying a slim leather briefcase and a legal pad already filled with neat handwriting. He shook my hand once, firmly, and asked for digital access to the full transaction history before we even sat down. I don't look for wrongdoing, he said calmly. I look for inconsistencies. That was a language I understood. We spread the estate records across the conference table, 7 years of statements, wire confirmations, internal memos from Mom's investment advisor. Alan worked without commentary at first, highlighting figures, circling dates, making columns of numbers I recognized instinctively. The first hour passed in silence. Then he tapped one line with the end of his pen. This one, he said. Walk me through it. March 12th. $125,000. Memo field. Temporary allocation. 3 weeks later, I said, sliding another document forward. Northbridge Holdings purchased a duplex in Aurora. He glanced at the LLC formation papers. Who controls this entity? My sister, I replied. And her partner? He nodded once and continued calculating. By late afternoon, Alan had mapped 12 major transfers. 8 routed directly to Victoria's business accounts. 4 moved indirectly through entities. Pattern indicates informal capital injection, he said. No structured repayment schedule. Would you characterize that as standard family assistance? Daniel asked. Standard assistance, Alan replied evenly. Doesn't usually involve intermediary LLCs. That night, Victoria called again. I heard you hired a forensic accountant, she said without greeting. I didn't hire him, I replied. The estate did. You're escalating. You filed a petition. Her exhale was sharp. This is supposed to stay in the family. It would have, I said quietly, if you hadn't taken it to court. She laughed once. You think this makes you righteous? I think it makes things documented. There was a pause. You don't know everything, she said finally. I know enough. The line went dead. 2 days later, Alan returned with a preliminary report. He laid it on the table without drama. Total documented transfers over 7 years. $480,000, he said. Of that, $175,000 flowed through secondary entities. Daniel leaned forward. Any evidence of repayment? Minimal. Approximately $35,000 documented as returned. No interest calculations. I studied the pages. Anything else? I asked. Alan flipped to the final section. There's one anomaly, he said. My attention sharpened. March 12th transfer, he continued. Funds left Margaret Hale's account and landed temporarily in an intermediary account before routing to Northbridge Holdings. The intermediary account is not registered under your sister's name. Whose name? Daniel asked. Alan slid the printed sheet toward us. Daniel Reeves. Victoria's boyfriend. For a moment, the room felt smaller. Was that disclosed in her petition? I asked. Daniel Whitmore shook his head. No, Alan continued calmly. If this was intended as a loan, standard documentation would require promissory notes. I see none. Could this rise to misappropriation? Daniel asked carefully. Alan did not answer immediately. It suggests informal commingling of estate funds with third-party accounts, he said. Intent would be a legal determination. I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't emotional mismanagement. It was structural. That evening, Keller and Associates submitted an amended claim. They alleged that Mom had verbally approved flexible use of funds and that any routing through Daniel Reeves's account was for administrative efficiency. Administrative efficiency. I forwarded the filing to Alan. He replied within an hour. Administrative efficiency does not typically require obscuring the funding source. Victoria texted shortly after. You're destroying everything. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'm preserving it. The next probate session was scheduled as an evidentiary hearing. Both sides would present findings. The night before, I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing the report again. Each page carried no emotion. Just dates. Numbers. Flow. I remembered Mom's face the night she asked me to look at the accounts. She hadn't looked betrayed. She had looked tired. I don't want confusion after I'm gone, she had said. Confusion. I closed the folder and drove to Aurora. The house was empty now, staged for listing. The realtor had left the back door unlocked for inspection. I stepped inside quietly. The kitchen felt smaller without furniture. I walked to the spot where we had sat reviewing statements. $480,000. Bridges. Temporary. I walked into the living room and stood beneath the window where Victoria used to cry after failed ventures. Mom had always stood beside her there. Protective. Supportive. Unquestioning. I didn't resent that. But I understood something now. Protection without structure becomes exposure. The following morning, the courtroom filled quickly. Victoria sat straighter than before, but her eyes moved more frequently. Alan Pierce testified calmly. He explained the transaction flow, the intermediary routing, the absence of formal loan agreements. Keller attempted to frame the transfers as informal family investments. Isn't it common, he asked, for families to operate without rigid contracts? Alan didn't shift. It's common, he said, for misunderstandings to arise when they do. The judge requested clarification regarding the intermediary account. Keller hesitated before acknowledging Daniel Reeves's involvement. Victoria's hand tightened visibly around the edge of the table. This was done for convenience, she said when given the opportunity to speak. Convenience? The judge asked. To simplify closing timelines. And was the decedent informed of that structure? Victoria's silence stretched half a beat too long. She trusted me, she said finally. The judge wrote something down. Trust? I had heard that word before. Outside the courtroom, Victoria approached me again. You could stop this, she said, voice low. You could say you misunderstood. I didn't misunderstand, I replied. You're turning paperwork into betrayal. No, I said. Paperwork revealed it. Her eyes burned with something close to fear. You don't know what this will cost. I know exactly what it costs, I said. It costs documentation. It costs exposure. It costs control. As she walked away, I realized something with quiet clarity. Victoria wasn't afraid of losing money. She was afraid of losing narrative. And numbers, once written clearly enough, are difficult to argue with. The number didn't make sense. I was sitting at my dining table again. Forensic report open beside my laptop. When I noticed it for the third time. March 12th, $125,000. But this time, I wasn't looking at the outgoing transfer from Mom's account. I was looking at the intermediary deposit confirmation Alan had subpoenaed. The routing number matched Daniel Reeves's personal account, not a business ledger. That alone was questionable. What didn't fit was the outgoing transfer from his account 3 days later. It wasn't $125,000. It was $115,000. $10,000 missing in transit? I zoomed in on the transaction detail. Fee! The notation read vaguely. Administrative adjustment. Administrative adjustment. I leaned back slowly. You don't lose $10,000 to administrative adjustments. I called Daniel Whitmore. There's a discrepancy, I said. He listened without interrupting. Forward me the documentation, he replied. Within an hour, he called back. Good catch, he said. That gap wasn't emphasized in the initial summary. It should be, I replied. It will be. The evidentiary continuation hearing was set for the following week. Victoria's side had argued that the forensic report was incomplete, that the estate was mischaracterizing routine transfers. Now the routine looked less routine. 3 days later, I sat across from Alan Pierce again. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the highlighted statement. That $10,000 wasn't routed to the property acquisition, he said. It remained in the intermediary account for approximately 6 weeks before being transferred elsewhere. Where? I asked. He slid another sheet toward me. Personal credit line payoff. Daniel Reeves's name. Silence settled between us. So estate funds temporarily reduced his personal debt. I said, That's one way to phrase it. Alan replied, Is there any documentation indicating Margaret Hale authorized that? None that I've seen. I felt the structure of the case shifting. This was no longer about whether Mom preferred one daughter over another. It was about whether estate assets had been diverted. That evening, Victoria showed up at my building again. This time, she didn't knock. She waited in the lobby. When I stepped off the elevator, she was standing beside the mailboxes, arms folded tightly. We need to talk, she said. Through attorneys, I replied. This is ridiculous. So is routing Mom's money through Daniel's account. Her face hardened. You don't understand how business works. I understand how ledgers work. It was temporary. $10,000 temporary. Her eyes flickered. That was a fee, she snapped. For what? Facilitating. Facilitating what? She stepped closer. You think you're exposing something criminal? I think I'm exposing something documented. Her voice dropped. If this goes further, it won't just hurt me. I didn't move the money, I said quietly. She looked at me as if she might say more. Instead, she shook her head and walked out of the building. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. The courtroom felt smaller than before. Victoria sat rigid, her attorney flipping through documents more quickly than usual. Daniel Whitmore leaned toward me. We're introducing supplemental trace findings, he said. Be prepared. The judge took the bench. Keller began by reiterating that the forensic review lacked full context. These were informal family investments, he said. There was no malicious intent. Daniel stood. Your Honor, supplemental records obtained under subpoena indicate that estate funds were routed through a third-party personal account and partially retained for non-estate obligations. Murmurs rippled softly through the gallery. Alan testified again, calmly outlining the $10,000 discrepancy. Was this amount returned to the estate? The judge asked. No, Alan replied. Was there written authorization from the decedent permitting such use? No. Keller rose quickly. This is being exaggerated, he said. The sum is minor relative to the estate total. The judge looked up. Minor or not, he said evenly. Unauthorized diversion of estate funds is material. Victoria shifted in her seat. When she was given the opportunity to respond, her composure slipped. It wasn't diversion, she said. It was temporary support for business liquidity. For whom? The judge asked. She hesitated. For closing efficiency. And the $10,000. Silence stretched. Her attorney touched her arm. Answer the question. The judge said, It covered facilitation costs. She replied tightly. Paid to whom? Another pause. The judge made a note. The room felt different now. Not explosive. Measured. The sealed attachment Daniel Whitmore had referenced earlier sat on the bench. Untouched. The judge glanced toward it briefly before turning back to counsel. "I will allow the supplemental forensic report into evidence," he said. "Further review will consider the totality of fund movement." The gavel struck once. Outside. The hallway buzzed quietly. Victoria approached me. But not with anger. With something closer to urgency. "You're going too far," she said. "I'm going exactly as far as the documents lead. You don't know what you're about to uncover." "I do," I replied. "Accountability." Her expression flickered. For the first time, I didn't see confidence. I saw calculation unraveling. When I stepped outside into the cold air, I felt something steady settle inside me. This had never been about $1.3 million. It had never been about sibling rivalry. It was about whether bridges had become tunnels. And tunnels, once mapped clearly enough, don't disappear. They lead somewhere. And we were getting closer to where this one ended. The final hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. I arrived early. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Lawyers moved briskly between metal detectors and elevators, their voices low and efficient. I took a seat on a wooden bench outside the probate courtroom and reviewed the supplemental report one last time. The numbers hadn't changed. They never do. When Victoria entered the hallway, she didn't look at me at first. Daniel Reeves walked beside her, his expression tight. Thomas Keller followed with a stack of binders pressed to his chest. Victoria finally glanced up. There was no smile this time. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. The gallery was fuller, 2 cousins. My aunt, even a neighbor from Aurora who must have heard through the quiet network of extended family. We rose when the judge entered. Estate of Margaret Hale. The clerk announced again. Daniel Whitmore stood first. "Your Honor, we submit into record the supplemental forensic findings and request review of the sealed attachment referenced in the codicil." The judge nodded once. "Proceed." Alan Pierce was sworn in again. He summarized the findings clearly. Estate funds totaling $480,000 were transferred over 7 years, he said. $175,000 flowed through secondary entities. $10,000 from a March 12 transfer was retained in a third-party account and applied to a personal credit obligation. The judge turned to Keller. "Do you dispute these figures?" Keller shifted. "We dispute characterization," he replied. There was no malicious intent. The decedent was aware of flexible usage arrangements. Was she aware funds were routed through Mr. Reeves' personal account? The judge asked. Keller hesitated. "There is no written record confirming or denying that." Silence followed. The judge leaned back slightly. "Very well," he said. "I will review the sealed attachment." Daniel Whitmore stepped forward and handed the cream-colored envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the bench. The courtroom felt suspended. The judge opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a signed explanatory memorandum, transaction summaries annotated by my mother, and a USB drive. The judge read the memorandum first. His eyes moved steadily across the page. Then he looked up. "This memorandum appears to detail the decedent's concerns regarding undocumented transfers and intermediary routing," he said. Victoria's hands tightened visibly in her lap. Daniel Whitmore spoke calmly. "Your Honor, the USB drive contains an audio recording made in my office at the decedent's request." A murmur moved through the room. The judge considered for a moment. "Play the relevant portion." The bailiff connected the drive. My mother's voice filled the courtroom. It was softer than I remembered, but steady. "I love both my daughters," she said in the recording. "But love does not eliminate responsibility. I have reviewed the accounts. I have seen transfers I did not authorize in structure. I trusted Victoria to use funds responsibly. I now understand I should have required documentation." The air felt thinner. "In appointing Olivia as trustee," my mother continued, "I am not punishing Victoria. I am protecting what remains. The recording ended. No one spoke. Victoria's face had gone pale. The judge looked directly at her. Do you dispute the authenticity of this recording? Her lips parted slightly. No, she said. Do you dispute the memorandum bearing your mother's signature? No. The judge nodded once. The court finds the codicil valid, he said. The trust structure stands. The forensic findings are admissible as evidence of estate management concerns. The petition to invalidate the amendment is denied. The words settled heavily. Keller leaned toward Victoria, whispering quickly. The judge continued. Further matters regarding potential recovery of diverted funds may proceed separately under civil review. This court will not invalidate the decedent's expressed intent. The gavel struck. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Outside the courtroom, voices rose in low waves. Victoria stood motionless for a moment before turning toward me. You could have let it go, she said. Her voice wasn't angry now. It was tired. Mom didn't, I replied. She looked as though she might argue. Instead, she shook her head. You always wanted control, she said quietly. I wanted clarity. Daniel Reeves touched her arm, urging her toward the exit. For the first time in my life, Victoria didn't command the room when she left it. The hallway felt strangely calm. Daniel Whitmore turned to me. You handled yourself well, he said. I didn't do anything, I replied. You allowed the record to speak, he corrected. As I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the weight in my chest wasn't triumph. It was structure. For years, Victoria's strength had been speed, moving faster than questions could form. Today, everything had slowed, measured, verified. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed once. A text from my aunt. I'm sorry we doubted you. I stared at the message. Doubt is easier than documentation. I typed a brief reply. It's okay. Then I set the phone down. The trust would activate fully within 30 days. Asset transfers would finalize. Oversight meetings would begin. There would be paperwork, audits, disbursement schedules. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. As I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, I thought back to that morning in Daniel Whitmore's office when Victoria had laughed. She believed the narrative was already written. She believed silence meant surrender. What she hadn't understood was simple. Silence backed by documentation is not weakness. It's timing. And when the record finally speaks, it doesn't raise its voice. It simply ends the argument. The first morning after the ruling felt almost ordinary. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin, pale lines across my kitchen table. My laptop sat open in front of me. The probate court's final order still visible on the screen. Coffee cooled in a mug beside it, untouched. The Hale Family Trust was officially active. No applause, no headlines, no dramatic reckoning, just a PDF stamped and signed. I read the order once more, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it settle properly. The amendment stood, the petition was denied, the trustee appointment was affirmed. My name was no longer missing from the record. It was central to it. By noon, I was on a conference call with the estate advisor assigned to oversee the transition. Asset liquidation timelines were reviewed. The Aurora House would close within 60 days. Investment accounts would transfer into trust management under structured allocation. I signed the trustee acknowledgement electronically. Fiduciary duty. It sounded clinical. It felt steady. Later that afternoon, Daniel Whitmore sent a brief message. Initial disbursement schedule attached. Victoria's allocation will proceed per trust conditions. I stared at the attachment. Despite everything, the structure did not exclude her. It limited. It required accountability. But it did not erase. I authorized the first scheduled release. Not because she asked, because the document required it. Extended family quieted in the weeks that followed. The whispers stopped. No one called to suggest I reconsider. No one asked if I would let it go. Instead, there was distance, measured, cautious. One evening, My aunt sent a short email. Your mother would be proud of how calmly you handled this. I read it twice before closing the message. Pride had always been quieter in our family than protection. Victoria did not contact me directly. Communication came through attorneys. There were discussions about partial repayment terms related to the intermediary routing. No dramatic collapse. No public scandal. Just adjustments. Boundaries formalized. A month after the ruling, I visited Mom's grave alone. The cemetery in Naperville was quiet. The trees just beginning to turn with early autumn color. I stood in front of the polished stone, tracing her name lightly with my fingers. I understand, I said softly. Not accusation. Not triumph. Understanding. She hadn't changed the will to punish. She had changed it to prevent confusion. To prevent chaos. To prevent me from inheriting a mess disguised as love. I sat on the bench nearby for a long time, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Growing up, I had believed strength meant absorbing impact quietly, letting birthdays be postponed, letting celebrations be redirected, letting bridges be built without asking how they were funded. This time, strength had looked different. It had looked like paperwork. When I returned home that evening, I opened the drawer in my desk and took out the manila folder. Inside were copies of everything. The original will, the codicil, the forensic report, the judge's order, and my mother's memorandum, signed in her careful handwriting. Olivia isn't loud. She's the one I trust. I didn't reread the pages. I simply closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer. For weeks, I had carried it like armor. Now it felt like archive. The trust required quarterly reviews, disbursement confirmations, ongoing compliance documentation. I attended the first oversight meeting via video conference, outlining projected income allocation and expense management protocols. Clear, measured, no raised voices. After the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This was what remained after the noise faded. Responsibility, clarity, control that didn't require performance. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it. If I regret pushing it that far. If the money was worth the fracture. It was never about $1.3 million. It was about whether I would continue to shrink so someone else could feel larger. It was about whether silence meant surrender. It doesn't. Not when the record is intact. On Sunday mornings now, I walk the same path along the river in downtown Naperville. The water moves steadily beneath the bridges, reflecting whatever light the sky offers. I notice my breathing more than I used to. I stop when I'm tired. I don't apologize for it. I pass families sometimes, mothers with daughters who look almost identical but move differently. One louder, one quieter. I don't know their stories. But I know this. Quiet does not mean weak. And documentation is not betrayal. It's protection. If you've ever been the daughter who was told you were strong enough not to need anything, if you've ever watched someone else control the narrative while you stayed steady in the background, I hope you remember this. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs structure. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the paperwork speak. If this story felt familiar in any way, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose boundaries over family comfort? Have you ever had to defend your name quietly, without raising your voice? You're welcome to share your experience. There are more stories like this about family, power, silence, and the moment when the record finally corrects itself. If that's something you value, you can stay, because sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a woman sitting calmly in a lawyer's office while someone else laughs, until the file is opened. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.